President.
The senior senator from North Dakota is recognized.
First, I thank my colleagues for their kind words, Senator Reid, our leader, and Senator Durbin, my colleague. I very much appreciate those kind words. I also must say I'm a little taken aback by what I heard earlier on the floor from some of our Republican colleagues, because it really does represent an attempt to rewrite history, at least the history that I've lived. I'm in my 26th year in the United States Senate. I announced a year and a half ago, a little more than that I would not seek re-election. So I don't have a political ox to gore here, but I am here to report what I have seen after 26 years of service here. And let me just start by saying our Republican colleagues at the leadership level decided early on that their strategy to be successful was to stop things from passing in the United States Senate. It is very clear that has been their strategy. That's why we have seen more than 380 filibusters in this body, which is completely unprecedented in the history of the United States Senate. Because the Republican leader made very clear years ago his highest priority was to defeat, for re-election, President Obama. He did not say his top priority was to solve the problems of the country. He did not say his top priority was to get our economy back on track. He did not say his top priority was to address the deficits and debt of the nation. He did not say his top priority was to improve the security position of the United States. He said his top priority was to defeat President Obama. Shame on him. Shame on him. That should never be the top priority of a leader in this body, Republican or Democrat. The top priority ought to be to help solve the problems the country confronts. Mr. President, I'm a little cranky because many of my colleagues know my wife and I have a little dog, Dakota, who's suffering from cancer. And last night, we were up from 12:30 to 5:30 as he was bleeding internally. And so I must say I'm a little cranky, having been up most of the night. And I got a lot crankier when I heard colleagues say things that they know are not true. That they know are not true. When they say there is no budget for the United States, they know that is not true. How do I know that it is true, that there is a budget? Well, because I remember what we voted on, and it's in writing. It's a law. It's called the Budget Control Act. And the Budget Control Act passed last year contained the budget for 2012 and 2013. Some say, well, that's not a budget. Well, let's look to the language of the law itself and see what it says. Here's what it says. For the purpose of enforcing the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, including Section 300 of that act, and enforcing budgetary points of order in prior concurrent resolutions on the budget, the allocations, aggregates, and spending levels set shall apply in the Senate in the same manner as for a concurrent resolution on the budget. What they're trying to do is mislead the American people by saying we've not passed a budget resolution. What they fail to tell people is that instead of a budget resolution, we passed a budget law. What's the difference? A resolution is purely a congressional document. It never goes to the president for his signature. A budget resolution is purely a congressional document. It never goes to the president for his signature. So instead of a resolution, we passed a budget law called the Budget Control Act. And it set out spending limits not just for 2012 and 2013. It actually set out on the discretionary side of the budget limits for 10 years. Mr. President, in fact, the Budget Control Act, in many ways, is more extensive than any budget resolution could provide. It has the force of law, unlike a budget resolution that's not signed by the President. It set discretionary caps on spending for 10 years instead of the 1 year normally set in a budget resolution. It provided enforcement mechanisms, including a 2-year provision allowing budget points of order to be enforced, and it created a reconciliation-like super committee process to address entitlement and tax reforms, and said if the special committee couldn't agree on reforming the entitlement programs and the tax system of the United States, there would be an additional $1.2 trillion in spending cuts. Mr. President, let's add it up. The Budget Control Act first cut $900 billion from the discretionary accounts over 10 years. Then it said if the super committee didn't reform the tax system, didn't reform the entitlement system of the country, there'd be another $1.2 trillion from the discretionary accounts over the next 10 years. That is a total of $2.1 trillion in spending cuts over the next 10 years. That is the biggest package of spending cuts in the history of the United States. Now, that's a fact. The Budget Control Act set the spending limits for 2012 and 2013, and further set limits for 8 years beyond that. So when they say there's no budget resolution, what they fail to tell people is there is a budget law. Now, Mr. President, it's interesting if we compare and contrast what their side presented as their priorities in a budget, because Mr. Ryan, now their candidate for vice president, came before the House of Representatives and laid out his budget blueprint. And what does that do? Well, first of all, it extends all of the Bush-era tax cuts. Now, think about this. Here we have a circumstance in which the revenue of the country is at or near a 60-year low. And the first thing the Ryan budget does is extend all the Bush-era tax cuts, even those for the very highest income, but then says, but that's not enough for the wealthiest among us. So the Ryan budget, after extending all the Bush-era tax cuts, goes and provides another $1 trillion of tax cuts for the wealthiest among us. I got nothing against wealthy people. I would hope all Americans have the opportunity to become wealthy. That'd be my fondest hope. That's really why I was drawn to public service. What could I do that would strengthen the economy of the United States? It's always been my top priority. It's what I truly believe is essential to our democracy. But in a circumstance in which we're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend, to say the answer is more and more tax cuts for the very wealthiest among us, and then to try to pay for it by shredding the social safety net that is critically important to those who are the least fortunate among us? Frankly, I think that fails the moral test. I think that fails any moral test of government. The Ryan budget, which our colleagues have endorsed here, would give, on average, those earning over $1 million a year an additional tax reduction of $265,000 a year. Now, I know if I were listening to this, I'd say, how can it be that somebody earning over $1 million can get a $265,000 tax cut? Because that's about all they'd pay in taxes. Remember, we're talking about the average for those earning over $1 million a year. So we're talking about not just people who earn $1 million a year, but people who earn hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And the average tax cut provided in the Ryan budget for those folks is another $265,000 a year. Mr. President, what does Ryan do in order to offset that massive additional tax cut for the very wealthiest among us? Well, here is an interesting quote from a former top economic advisor to Ronald Reagan, a man named Bruce Bartlett, who was a top economic advisor to Ronald Reagan. Here's what he said about the Ryan budget that our colleagues here have endorsed. Distributionally, the Ryan plan is a monstrosity. The rich would receive huge tax cuts, while the social safety net would be shredded to pay for them. Even as an opening bid to begin budget negotiations with the Democrats, the Ryan plan cannot be taken seriously. It is less of a wish list than a fairy tale, utterly disconnected from the real world, backed up by make-believe numbers and unreasonable assumptions. Ryan's plan isn't even an act of courage. It's just pandering to the Tea Party. A real act of courage would have been for him to admit, as all serious budget analysts know, that the revenues will have to rise well above 19% of GDP to stabilize the debt. Mr. President, those are not my words. Those are the words of a top economic advisor to President Ronald Reagan. The Ryan plan is a monstrosity. Mr. President, if anybody seriously studies the Ryan budget, you'd have to conclude that Mr. Bartlett is correct, because not only does he cut taxes in a very dramatic way for the richest among us. Let me just be clear. First thing he does is extend all the Bush-era tax cuts. Then on top of that, he cuts the top rate from 35% to 25%. That provides over $1 trillion of additional tax cuts for the wealthiest among us. And they refuse to do anything to close the tax loopholes that are allowing certain wealthy people to avoid paying taxes in this country entirely. I've shown on the floor of the Senate many times a picture of a 5-story building in the Cayman Islands called the Udlin House. The Udlin House claims to be the home of 18,000 companies. A little 5-story building in the Cayman Islands claims to be the home of 18,000 companies. I've said that's the most efficient building in the world. Can you imagine 18,000 companies operating out of a little 5-story building down the Cayman Islands? All those companies claim they're doing business out of that little building for a reason. They claim they're doing business out of that little building in the Cayman Islands because they don't want to pay taxes in the United States. And so you know what they do? It's very clever. Through paper manipulations, they show the profits of certain of their companies in the Cayman Islands rather than in the places where they actually earned the profits. Well, why would they do that? Well, because the Cayman Islands doesn't have a corporate income tax. And so by showing their profits in the Cayman Islands, even though in truth they were never earned in the Cayman Islands, but through accounting gimmicks they show their profits in the Cayman Islands, they aren't taxed. And they avoid paying here what they legitimately owe here. And what does that mean? That means all the rest of us get stuck paying for ourselves and them. Mr. President, the Ryan budget, I said earlier, fails the moral test. Well, you know, it's not just my judgment that it fails the moral test, because how can you justify cutting taxes dramatically for the wealthiest among us and then turn around and shred Medicare, which is what the Ryan budget did. The Ryan budget that he initially proposed took Medicare, which currently finances 75% of health care costs for seniors who are eligible. The Ryan budget over time would switch that so that instead of Medicare paying 75%, Medicare would pay 32%. So just to be clear, under the Ryan plan, we would wind up with a situation in which the majority of your health care costs, if you're eligible for Medicare, would be paid by you, not by Medicare. That's to make up for the massive tax cuts he gives the wealthiest among us. Here's what the Catholic bishops said. The Catholic bishops said the Ryan budget fails the moral test. Mr. President, I agree with the Catholic bishops. This is what they said in the lead. This is in the Washington Post in 2012. A week after House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan said that his Catholic faith inspired the Republicans' cost-cutting budget plan, the nation's Catholic bishops reiterated their demand that the federal budget protect the poor and said the GOP measure fails to meet these moral criteria. Mr. President, in any moral test that I know of in any religion, you don't take from those who have the least to give it to those who have the most. I don't know of any religion that practices that as an article of faith, that you take from those that have the least to give to those that have the most. Now, anybody that knows me knows I'm pretty conservative. I come from a business family. I have a master's in business administration. I have been, throughout my career, somebody who has been judged fiscally conservative, somebody that believes deeply in balancing budgets. I was the grandfather of the Bowles-Simpson Commission, served on it proudly, was one of the 11 votes for its product, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent. And by the way, when our colleague said this morning we haven't worked in a bipartisan way, well, I've spent 5 years working in a bipartisan way to try to get our deficits and debt under control. Senator Gregg, the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, and I proposed the Bowles-Simpson Commission. We served on it. We voted for it. Subsequently served in the group of 6, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, that were given the assignment by our colleagues to come up with a plan to reduce the deficit. Worked a year and a half to try to find a bipartisan solution. We've had the Biden group, we've had the super committee, all bipartisan efforts that have gone on for years to try to produce an agreement. So our friends saying there hasn't been an effort, that's just not true. But what is also true is when our friends on the other side were in charge, they brought this economy to the brink of financial collapse. Now that's the truth. Anybody who doubts it, simply go back to the end of the Bush administration and see where the country was. The stock market was collapsing. The housing market was collapsing. The financial system was collapsing. That's what President Obama inherited. He did not create those crises, he inherited them. At the time President Obama came into office, the economy was shrinking at a rate of almost 9% a year. We were losing 800,000 jobs a month. Now the economy is growing at a rate of about 2% a year, and we're gaining about 200,000 jobs a month. That is a dramatic turnaround. So when they ask the question, are we better off now than 4 years ago? Undeniably, we are better off. Undeniably, we are better off. We've gone from an economy shrinking at a rate of more than 8% to one growing 2%. We have moved from a time when we were losing 800,000 jobs a month to a time when we are gaining 200,000 jobs a month. We have gone from a circumstance in which the stock market was plunging to a circumstance in which the stock market has about doubled during the time of President Barack Obama. President Obama inherited two wars, a war on terror, a financial system that was collapsing, a financial system that had seen under the previous president the debt double, foreign holdings of U.S. debt were tripled, and this president has ended the slide and got us going back in the right direction, and with precious little help from the other side. Mr. President, I ask the American people before they cast their votes to think back to the final days of the Bush administration. I will never forget, as long as I live, being called to an emergency meeting in this building with the Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, the leaders, Republicans and Democrats of the House and the Senate, and being told by the Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve that if they did not act, they expected a financial collapse within days. A financial collapse within days. Those were in the final months of the Bush administration. That is what President Barack Obama inherited. The hard fact is, when our colleagues were in charge of everything, they had the House, they had the Senate, they controlled the White House, they brought this country to the brink of financial collapse. That is a fact. Mr. President, thank goodness, this president, acting with this Congress, was able to draw us back from the brink. But we got a long way to go. We got a long way to go. And it's going to take everybody working together to pull this out of the ditch completely. I have been part of major efforts for the last 5 years, bipartisan efforts. Bowles-Simpson, Group of Six. Right now, we have the Group of Six has been expanded to a Group of Eight. We have been working nonstop. Hundreds of hours of discussions on a bipartisan plan, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, to be enacted when we return, to get America back on track. Mr. President, that's what's required here. What we saw this morning from our colleagues on the other side, that's not the answer. That's the problem. The same old, tired political gamesmanship is not going to cut it. What we desperately need is Republicans and Democrats working together to solve America's problems. That's what we owe the American people. And I very much hope when we return after this election that colleagues on both sides will be prepared to act in that spirit. I thank the chair and yield the floor.